Hello everyone, welcome to my talk, The Dark Side of Morality, Group Polarization and Moral Belief Formation. Here's a quick preview of what's to come. I'm going to summarize 3 empirical theories of group polarization. I'll then argue that all 3 theories predict that a widely endorsed discovery model of morality is a substantial cause of polarization. Finally, I'll show how the theories predict that a new negotiation model of morality promises not only to prevent polarization, but promote its opposite, a progressive willingness to cooperate and compromise. Before proceeding, I want to note that this is an abridged paper, shortened by about half for this conference. The conference paper focuses on a few initial steps, showing how widely accepted the discovery model is, how it theoretically causes polarization, and how a negotiation model can be theoretically expected to do the opposite. The paper omits a long discussion of exactly how the negotiation model works, as well as discussions of how we should normatively evaluate polarization and test the paper's empirical hypotheses. Let us begin by looking at the nature of group polarization, as well as at some recent trends. Group polarization is the tendency for individuals in opposing groups to develop and act upon progressively more extreme points of view. It thereby includes both attitudinal polarization, or progressively more extreme beliefs and attitudes, as well as decisional polarization, the tendency of groups and individuals in them to make decisions that are more extreme than the initial inclinations of their members. It should go without saying that polarization seems to be everywhere today. It's no secret that we're surrounded by it, on social media, in protests and counter-protests, political campaigns, and so on. Further, as we see in the following 2 figures, polarization has skyrocketed in recent years, particularly since the advent of social media. In the United States, Democrats and Republicans are moving ever further apart in terms of their political decisions and ideological divisions, and similar trends have been observed elsewhere. There is also the notable rise of so-called echo chambers. We see people in opposing social and political groups form increasingly cloistered social networks, interacting primarily with like-minded others. These groups have dramatically different and often biased news feeds, tend to visit different websites, watch different news networks, and so on. Finally, polarization has been linked to a variety of disturbing social effects. It is known to increase prejudice among the already prejudiced, increase selfishness and competitiveness between groups, increase the extremity of political decisions, erode public trust, increase the severity of criminal punishments, and even be conducive to war and other forms of group violence. Once again, we see these disturbing effects of polarization daily in international conflicts, domestic politics, social movements, and so on. We are, it seems, a world increasingly torn apart by polarization. Let's now look at what causes polarization. The psychosocial causes of group polarization are surprisingly well understood. There are 3 leading empirical theories. The first 2, social comparison theory and informational influence theory, are well supported by empirical evidence. The third, social categorization theory, is newer, but also has some empirical support. They are therefore not mere theories of polarization, but are better described as having isolated 3 causal mechanisms of polarization. Social comparison theory holds that polarization results from individuals adopting more extreme positions to impress members of their in-group, thereby proving themselves to the group as a kind of moral grandstanding. Because many individuals in the group fall prey to the very same tendency, the beliefs and attitudes of the group then shift over time in a progressively more extreme direction. This mechanism is also known to be especially prominent with respect to judgmental issues, which moral issues obviously are. Informational influence theory supplements this account with a second causal mechanism. It holds that polarization results from the tendency of individuals to congregate with like-minded others, who then present novel information and arguments in favor of the group's views, in turn making individual members of the group more amenable to new information and arguments favoring more extreme views. Interestingly, this mechanism is known to be especially prominent with respect to intellectant issues, or issues involving rational thought and argument, which of course is how moral issues are often understood. Finally, social categorization theory recognizes a third familiar mechanism, the tendency of groups to cluster around a group identity, whose members then come to hold progressively extreme views as a kind of defense mechanism of the group against threatening outgroups. There are many obvious examples in history and the present that immediately come to mind. Now let's shift gears and think about how laypeople and philosophers typically understand morality. Throughout much of human history, many people have subscribed to what I like to call the authority model of morality. On this model, moral truths emanate from some authority, such as God or political leaders. While some people still subscribe to this conception, ever since the Enlightenment, another conception of morality has been in ascendance, the notion that moral truths can be discovered by anyone through the use of our critical faculties. Notice that both of these conceptions hold that moral truths can in some way be discovered. The authority model holds that moral truths are discovered by consulting relevant authorities. The post-enlightenment model holds that moral truths are discovered by our critical faculties, either by reason or intuition or an emotional moral sense or some combination thereof. In other words, moral thought has long been dominated by what we might call a discovery model of morality. I like to understand this model as comprised by two components. The first is a discovery model of metaethics, the view that moral truths exist to be discovered through an individual's own use of their cognition. The second is that people who subscribe to this metaethical view will tend to form moral beliefs as a result of some kind of discovery process, such as intuition or argumentation, coming to believe that they have discovered moral truths via that method. The discovery model is clearly dominant, both in everyday life and in moral philosophy. It is dominant in metaethics, where it is commonly held that moral truths can be discovered. It is also dominant in normative ethics, where virtue ethicists, Kantians, utilitarians, contractualists, and so on all tend to hold that moral truths can be discovered, albeit in different ways. Finally, the model is dominant in applied ethics, where we see it commonly presupposed that answers to applied moral questions can be resolved through philosophical argument. Post-Enlightenment versions of the discovery model have been instrumental to important forms of moral progress, and we should not discount this. It is, however, an open question whether the model is correct, including whether it is the most beneficial model to adopt in practice. In my 2016 book, Rightness is Fairness, A Moral and Political Theory, I argue that in order to set moral philosophy on firmer epistemic footing, it should be based on 7 principles of theory selection adapted from the hard sciences. I then argue that these principles require basing moral philosophy on empirical moral psychology and instrumental rationality. Finally, I argue that moral psychology supports reducing morality to diachronic or cross-time rationality, as specified by 4 principles of fairness. Because these principles identify moral rightness with fairly negotiated compromises, I conclude that moral truths in general are not discovered, but rather created by real-world negotiation. I mentioned a moment ago that my account aims to reduce morality to diachronic rationality. While readers may be skeptical of such an attempted reduction, I cannot address those issues today. What I'd like to ask readers to keep in mind instead is how my argument to come plausibly addresses diachronic issues. If I am right, the discovery model causes polarization, something that plausibly makes it more difficult for people to achieve their own goals over time, as they then have to fight against other people and opposing groups. If, as I predict, the negotiation model will prevent polarization, then there are some reasons to think that this model promises to make it easier for people to achieve their goals over time through cooperation and compromise, thus making the model diachronically superior to the discovery model. We can begin to see this, I believe, by reflecting intuitively on what happens when people believe they've made different moral discoveries. Consider these 2 individuals, a person who thinks that he's discovered that abortion is wrong, and another person who believes she has discovered abortion is permissible. What will these people do with their supposed discoveries? Well, we see what these people do every day, don't we? At an individual level, they often get into heated arguments about their moral discoveries, at dinner tables, on social media, and so on. They argue at each other, rarely, or so it seems, convincing those who disagree with them that they're right. Worse yet, as we all well know, people tend to form groups, and we know what happens when groups disagree over moral issues. They rarely seem willing to compromise. Instead, there are arguments defending their moral discoveries, and all too often, slogans and name-calling. This isn't just true intuitively. All 3 theories of group polarization predict that progressive polarization is exactly what will happen when people subscribe to a discovery model. Once a group's members believe they have discovered a moral truth, all 3 theories predict that polarization will be off to the races. Allow me to explain how. Recall that social comparison theory holds that polarization results from individuals seeking to impress their fellow group members by adopting more extreme views. Suppose then we have a group whose members believe that they've discovered a moral truth, say a truth about abortion. Social comparison theory predicts that people in this moral group will aim to impress each other by adopting still more extreme views, which, as I note in the paper, can plainly be seen in public discourse on abortion and other moral issues. So, social comparison theory predicts that the discovery model of morality is a causal mechanism of polarization, and likely a strong one at that. Now turn to informational influence theory. It holds that polarization results from individuals in a group presenting novel information and arguments that make the group's members more susceptible to adopting even more extreme views. I give examples in the paper of how this occurs, illustrating how once a group makes a supposed moral discovery about abortion or gun control or whatever, there's a tendency for the members of the group to present each other with new information and arguments confirming the original view and pushing it in a more extreme direction. Finally, social categorization theory makes similar predictions. It holds that groups tend to coalesce around a group identity, viewing opposing groups as threatening outsiders, and that as a defense mechanism, groups adopt progressively more extreme views to rally their own members against the feared outgroup. So then, suppose a group coalesces around a so-called moral discovery, say the discovery that abortion is wrong. Social categorization theory predicts that groups that coalesce around such discoveries will tend to view individuals and groups that don't share the discovery as threatening outsiders, thereby cultivating ever more extreme moral views in the in-group to rally their members against those threatening out-groups, which again is all too familiar from everyday life. There are also reasons to believe the internet and social media dramatically magnify all three causal mechanisms. In the internet age, people have the near-instantaneous ability to impress fellow group members, qua social comparison theory, disseminate new arguments and information, qua informational influence theory, and formulate and react to threatening out-groups, qua social categorization theory. Again, we see these mechanisms play out every day. Now let us consider an alternative model of morality. As I mentioned earlier, in Rightness is Fairness, I defend a negotiation model according to which two regulative ideals of coercion minimization and mutual assistance can be discovered through rational inquiry, but answers to all other moral questions, including how to resolve conflicts between these ideals and balance them against other trade-offs, must be created by processes of fair negotiation constrained by these ideals. Like the discovery model, I'd like to understand this model as defined by two claims. First, a meta-ethical claim that most moral truths are not discoverable, but instead created by fair negotiation. And second, a model of moral belief formation, according to which people should believe that morality fundamentally requires negotiation, only forming beliefs about what else morality requires only after compromises have been negotiated. It's important to note, however, that this is only true for moral disagreements plausibly consistent with regulative ideals of coercion minimization and mutual assistance, as well as fair bargaining. Because things like slavery, racism, sexism, and so on are not plausibly consistent with these things, the model holds that some moral views are not to be negotiated with. In other words, the negotiation model requires us to adopt a certain moral psychology. We must first of all recognize regulative ideals of coercion minimization and mutual assistance as constraints on negotiation, recognize that these ideals can conflict with each other and other trade-offs, recognize that people on different sides of the moral issue in question can therefore have morally legitimate different views and preferences for how to settle that issue, and finally, be willing to negotiate a compromise in good faith with those people, identifying the resulting compromise with moral rightness unless and until a new compromise is arrived at. Now let us think about the implications of this moral psychology. As I illustrate here, at the level of individuals, it should lead people of goodwill who accept the same right ideals but have different priorities to be willing to compromise with each other. Now return to group psychology. Suppose that increasing numbers of people began to subscribe to the negotiation model, believing that morality fundamentally requires negotiation and compromise. Social comparison theory predicts that the very same mechanism which leads to polarization in the case of the discovery model should now lead to the exact opposite. People aiming to impress their fellow group members by advancing more extreme versions of the belief that morality should be negotiated. While there is the potential worry that this could lead to an overwillingness to compromise, an issue we can't settle here but I've tried to address elsewhere, research to date has found that groups organized around these kinds of ideals do indeed reduce polarization and increase a willingness to cooperate. Informational influence theory also predicts that a negotiation model should reduce polarization, as it predicts that individuals and groups that subscribe to the model should seek out and selectively present new information and arguments that reinforce the model, leading people to become even more willing to negotiate with others. Finally, social categorization theory predicts that individuals and groups that subscribe to the model should form a group identity around a willingness to negotiate and compromise, regarding all such people of goodwill as members of an in-group, despite different moral priorities, only regarding those that reject the two regulative ideals and fair bargaining as threatening outgroups. In other words, all three theories of polarization predict that the negotiation model will harness what are currently polarizing mechanisms to produce the opposite, a willingness to engage in productive compromise with others, with one exception: individuals and groups who subscribe to fundamentally abhorrent moral ideals or are unwilling to bargain fairly, which I think is highly intuitive. Morality generally requires compromise, but not with racists, sexists, and so on, whose oppressive views we can and should fight against. Another simpler way to put this is that if the negotiation model became increasingly accepted, people should form negotiating groups with very different preferences and priorities, as we see illustrated here in the case of abortion, but who recognize the legitimacy of the other side's moral ideals and different preferences, and would therefore be willing to forge and uphold a compromise. In conclusion, most people, both today and throughout history, including philosophers, have tended to believe that moral truths can be discovered. I've argued that there are systematic theoretical reasons to believe that this discovery model of morality plays directly into the kind of group polarization that is currently tearing our world apart. I then argue that there are converse reasons to believe that an alternative negotiation model of morality promises the exact opposite, to undercut polarization, bringing people of goodwill together to form productive, fair compromises despite our differences. Obviously, many issues remain. Among other things, this paper has been primarily theoretical. Its theoretical predictions can and should be tested. By a similar token, there are broader philosophical questions about the desirability of polarization and what the overall social costs and benefits of the two models of morality are. Finally, there is, of course, the question of whether my particular version of the negotiation model is correct. Unfortunately, I must leave these questions for another day, but hope interested readers consider examining them further. Thank you all so much for listening, and to the Minds Online organizers for inviting me to this conference, as well as my two commentators for their excellent feedback. I very much look forward to a good discussion. Thanks again.